thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Bookshop Memories by George Orwell. Read by The Voice Before the Void. Like that.
I suppose not.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose not.
Let's see. When I worked in a second-hand bookshop, so easily pictured, if you don't work in one, as a kind of paradise where charming old gentlemen browse eternally among calf-bound folios, the thing that chiefly struck me was the rarity of really bookish people. Our shop had an exceptionally interesting stock, yet I doubt whether 10% of our customers knew a good book from a bad one. First edition snobs were much commoner than lovers of literature, but Oriental students haggling over cheap textbooks were commoner still, and vague-minded women looking for birthday presents for their nephews were commonest of all. Many of the people who came to us were of the kind who would be a nuisance anywhere, but have special opportunities in a bookshop. For example, the dear old lady who wants a book for an invalid, a very common demand that, and the other dear old lady who read such a nice book in 1897 and wonders whether you can find her a copy. Unfortunately, she doesn't remember the title, or the author's name, or what the book was about, but she does remember that it had a red cover. But apart from these, there are two well-known types of pest by whom every second-hand bookshop is haunted. One is the decayed person smelling of old bread crusts who comes every day, sometimes several times a day, and tries to sell you worthless books. The other is the person who orders large quantities of books for which he has not the smallest intention of paying. In our shop, we sold nothing on credit, but we would put books aside, or order them if necessary, for people who arranged to fetch them away later. Scarcely half the people who ordered books from us ever came back. It used to puzzle me at first. What made them do it? They would come in and demand some rare and expensive book, would make us promise over and over again to keep it for them, and then would vanish never to return. But many of them, of course, were unmistakable paranoiacs. They used to talk in a grandiose manner about themselves and tell the most ingenious stories to explain how they'd happened to come out of doors without any money, stories which, in many cases, I am sure they themselves believed. In a town like London, there are always plenty of not quite certifiable lunatics walking the streets, and they tend to gravitate towards bookshops, because a bookshop is one of the few places where you can hang out for a long time without spending any money. In the end, one gets to know these people almost at a glance. For all their big talk, there is something moth-eaten and aimless about them. Very often, when we were dealing with an obvious paranoiac, we would put aside the books he had asked for, and then put them back on the shelves the moment he had gone. None of them, I noticed, ever attempted to take books away without paying for them. Merely to order them was enough. It gave them, I suppose, the illusion that they were spending real money. Like most second-hand bookshops, we had various sidelines. We sold second-hand typewriters, for instance, and also stamps. Used stamps, I mean. Stamp collectors are a strange, silent, fish-like breed, of all ages, but only of the male sex. Women apparently fail to see the peculiar charm of gumming bits of colored paper into albums. We also sold 6-penny horoscopes compiled by somebody who claimed to have foretold the Japanese earthquake. They were in sealed envelopes, and I never opened one of them myself, but the people who bought them often came back and told us how true their horoscopes had been. Doubtless any horoscope seems true if it tells you that you are highly attractive to the opposite sex, and your worst fault is generosity. We did a good deal of business in children's books, chiefly remainders. Modern books for children are rather horrible things, especially when you see them in the mass. Personally, I would sooner give a child a copy of Petrenius Arbiter than Peter Pan, but even Barry seems manly and wholesome compared with some of his later imitators. At Christmas time, we spent a feverish 10 days struggling with Christmas cards and calendars, which are tiresome things to sell, but good business while the season lasts. It used to interest me to see the brutal cynicism with which Christian sentiment is exploited. The touts from the Christmas card firms used to come round with their catalogs as early as June. A phrase from one of their invoices sticks in my memory. It was, 2 dozen infant Jesus with rabbits. But our principal sideline was a lending library, the usual 2-penny no-deposit library of 500 or 600 volumes, all fiction. How the book thieves must love those libraries. It is the easiest crime in the world to borrow a book at one shop for 2 pence, remove the label, and sell it at another shop for a shilling. Nevertheless, booksellers generally find it pays better to have a certain number of books stolen, we used to lose about a dozen a month, than to frighten customers away by demanding a deposit. Our shop stood exactly on the frontier between Hampstead and Camden Town, and we were frequented by all types, from baronets to bus conductors. Probably our library subscribers were a fair cross-section of London's reading public. It is therefore worth noting that of all the authors in our library, the one who went out the best was Priestley, Hemingway, Walpole, Wodehouse? No. Ethel M. Dell, with Warwick Deeping a good second, and Geoffrey Farnell, I should say, third. Dell's novels, of course, are read solely by women, but by women of all kinds and ages, and not, as one might expect, merely by wistful spinsters and the fat wives of tobacconists. It is not true that men don't read novels, but it is true that there are whole branches of fiction that they avoid. Roughly speaking, what one might call the average novel, the ordinary, good-bad, Galsworthy and water stuff, which is the norm of the English novel, seems to exist only for women. Men read either the novels it is possible to respect or detective stories. But their consumption of detective stories is terrific. One of our subscribers, to my knowledge, read 4 or 5 detective stories every week for over a year, besides others which he got from another library. What chiefly surprised me was that he never read the same book twice. Apparently the whole of that frightful torrent of trash, the pages read every year would, I calculated, cover nearly 3/4 of an acre, was stored forever in his memory. He took no notice of titles or authors' names, but he could tell by merely glancing into a book whether he had it already. In a lending library, you see people's real tastes, not their pretended ones. And the one thing that strikes you is how completely the classical English novelists have dropped out of favor. It is simply useless to put Dickens, Thackeray, Jane Austen, Trollope, etc. into the ordinary lending library. Nobody takes them out. At the mere sight of a 19th century novel, people say, "Oh, but that's old," and shy away immediately. Yet it is always fairly easy to sell Dickens, just as it is always easy to sell Shakespeare. Dickens is one of those authors whom people are always meaning to read, and, like the Bible, he is widely known at second hand. People know by hearsay that Bill Sikes was a burglar, and that Mr. Micawber had a bald head, just as they know by hearsay that Moses was found in a basket of bulrushes, and saw the back parts of the Lord. Another thing that is very noticeable is the growing unpopularity of American books. And another, the publishers get into a stew about this every 2 or 3 years, is the unpopularity of short stories. The kind of person who asks the librarian to choose a book for him nearly always starts by saying, "I don't want short stories," or "I do not desire little stories," as a German customer of ours used to put it. If you ask them why, they sometimes explain that it is too much fag to get used to a new set of characters with every story. They like to get into a novel, which demands no further thought after the first chapter. I believe, though, that the writers are more to blame here than the readers. Most modern short stories, English and American, are utterly lifeless and worthless, far more so than most novels. The short stories which are stories are popular enough, vide D.H. Lawrence, whose short stories are as popular as his novels. Would I like to be a bookseller de métier? On the whole, in spite of my employer's kindness to me, and some happy days I spent in the shop, no. Given a good pitch and the right amount of capital, any educated person ought to be able to make a small, secure living out of a bookshop. Unless one goes in for rare books, it is not a difficult trade to learn, and you start at a great advantage if you know anything about the insides of books. Most booksellers don't. You can get their measure by having a look at their trade papers where they advertise their wants. If you don't see an ad for Boswell's Decline and Fall, you are pretty sure to see one for The Mill on the Floss by T.S. Eliot. Also, it is a humane trade which is not capable of being vulgarized beyond a certain point. The combines can never squeeze the small independent bookseller out of existence as they have squeezed the grocer and the milkman. But the hours of work are very long. I was only a part-time employee, but my employer put in a 70-hour week, apart from constant expeditions out of hours to buy books. And it is an unhealthy life. As a rule, a bookshop is horribly cold in winter. Because if it is too warm, the windows get misted over, and a bookseller lives on his windows. And books give off more and nastier dust than any other class of objects yet invented. And the top of a book is the place where every bluebottle prefers to die. But the real reason why I should not like to be in the book trade for life is that while I was in it, I lost my love of books. A bookseller has to tell lies about books, and that gives him a distaste for them. Still worse is the fact that he is constantly dusting them and hauling them to and fro. There was a time when I really did love books, love the sight and smell and feel of them. I mean, at least if they were 50 or more years old. Nothing pleased me quite so much as to buy a job lot of them for $1 at a country auction. There is a peculiar flavor about the battered, unexpected books you pick up in that kind of collection. minor 18th century poets, out-of-date gazetteers, odd volumes of forgotten novels, bound numbers of ladies' magazines of the 60s. For casual reading, in your bath, for instance, or late at night when you're too tired to go to bed, or in the odd quarter of an hour before lunch, there is nothing to touch a back number of the girl's own paper. But as soon as I went to work in the bookshop, I stopped buying books. Seen in the mass, 5 or 10,000 at a time, books were boring, and even slightly sickening. Nowadays, I do buy one occasionally, but only if it is a book I want to read and can't borrow, and I never buy junk. The sweet smell of decaying paper appeals to me no longer. It is too closely associated in my mind with paranoiac customers and dead blue bottles. There's a lot of education in that short essay there. That says a lot.
It is quite timeless, like you said.
Yeah. Published in Fortnightly, November 1936.
What have you done with the water that was outside on the step?
I brought it in here. I put it right here.
And now it is mine again.
I've got a few other essays by Orwell. I don't know if I read all these. In Defense of English Cooking. How the Poor Die. Looking Back on the Spanish War. Not Counting Niggers. Holy shit. What is that? Good Bad Books. Freedom of the Park.